All right, everyone, welcome back to our RadBio session. We've gone through the basics, external beam fractionation. But today, we're really shifting gears. We're talking brachytherapy,
Yeah.
placing the source right there next to or even inside the tumor.
Right up close.
And that closeness, plus how the dose hits. Well, it brings in a whole different layer of radiobiology we really need to unpack. This session is all about getting sharp on that unique brachybiology, super important, for residents hitting the clinic or prepping for boards.
Exactly. Brachy isn't just a external beam turned inside out. The physics is different, and yeah, critically, the biology changes too. We're going to dig into how familiar ideas think linear, quadratic model, repair, dose rate, how they apply differently here.
Okay.
We'll look at the two main types, low dose rate, LDR, and high dose rate, HDR. Compare the biology, get familiar with the isotopes you'll actually see, and really underline the clinical power of that steep dose fall off you get.
Great. Let's jump right in then. Starting with foundation. Low dose rate, LDR. The slow burn approach, how's that defined?
Okay, so LDR uses sources that deliver radiation continuously, but over a long time. We're talking days, sometimes even the whole decay period for permanent seeds.
Right.
And the dose rate itself, pretty low, usually in the range of, say, 0.4 up to maybe 2 grays per hour.
Okay, continuous, low rate. It sounds like it gives cells a lot of time to, well, react. What's the biggest radiobiological thing happening during that long exposure?
Repair, yeah, hands down. Continuous repair of sublethal damage. That's the dominant factor in LDR.
So damage happens, but the cell has time to fix it even while the radiation's still on.
Exactly. As soon as a sublethal hit occurs, the repair mechanisms can kick in during the ongoing irradiation.
And how does that play out differently? Say, normal tissues versus the tumor.
Well, for normal tissues, this is a huge advantage, especially for those late responding ones, the low alpha-beta tissues, around 3 gray. They're really good at repairing this kind of damage, so that slow, steady dose delivery gives them plenty of time to fix things up, which leads to significant tissue sparing. It's why they can often tolerate surprisingly high total LDR doses.
But wait, tumor cells repair too, don't they? Aren't we potentially just making the tumor tougher?
That's a really critical point. Yes, tumor cells absolutely repair as well. And that does reduce the killing effectiveness compared to, say, a quick HDR blast.
So what's the strategy?
The strategy with LDR is really to exploit the differences. Maybe the tumor cells are less efficient at repair than the critical normal tissues nearby. Or maybe they're dividing so fast that proliferation during the treatment kind of counteracts some of the repair. You're banking on those different kinetics to get a therapeutic gain.
That makes sense. It's a differential effect you're aiming for. Okay, so if repair is happening constantly, how does the linear quadratic model, especially BCD, fit in? That standard formula, BED equals N times D times 1 plus D over alpha beta, that's for separate fractions, right?
Right, exactly. That formula assumes repair happens between fractions. For continuous LDR, you've got to factor in repair happening during the dose delivery. What the models generally show is that at these really low dose rates, the beta component, the part from 2 sublethal hits interacting to cause death, becomes much less significant.
Why is that?
Because there's just so much time between those individual radiation hits for repair to happen before a second hit lands nearby.
So the dose response curve flattens out a bit, looks more linear?
Pretty much, yeah. Cell killing starts to look more like a linear alpha-type response, especially at the lower end of LDR rates. There are more complex models, Leah-Ketch side, G functions, modified BED equations that try to quantify this precisely, incorporating time factors for repair.
But the take-home message for boards.
Well, the key concept is, because of all that continuous repair, LDR is less biologically damaging per gray than HDR or a single big external beam fraction. You need a higher total physical dose with LDR to get the same biological kick.
Okay, got it. What about other cell stuff? Cell cycle effects, reassortment, repopulation in LDR.
Well, cells are still cycling during that long LDR exposure, so yeah, some reassortment can happen, cells moving through different phases. But it's a bit murky because the low dose rate itself might cause delays, or maybe cells pile up in resistant phases. It's not quite as clear-cut as with fractionated therapy.
And repopulation. If treatment takes days or weeks, that's a long time for tumor cells to keep dividing.
Huge issue. Yeah, absolutely. This is a major potential downside of LDR, especially for faster growing tumors. If the treatment stretches out too long compared to how fast the tumor doubles, you can get significant repopulation, which could undermine the whole treatment.
So the dose rate has to be high enough to stay ahead.
Exactly. It needs to be high enough to kill cells faster than they can regrow. There's essentially a critical dose rate fall below that, and proliferation just wins.
What about oxygen? The oxygen effect, reoxygenation.
Mm-hmm.
Does LDR slow burn offer any advantage there?
It potentially can. As cells are killed off gradually, the tumor might shrink a bit.
Improving blood flow.
Right, improving the vasculature to areas that were previously hypoxic, low on oxygen,
Ah, so those cells become oxygenated again.
and become more sensitive to the radiation that's still being delivered. So yes, reoxygenation is seen as a potential plus for LDR's long delivery time. The OER for any single radiation event might be similar, but the sheer length of treatment gives more opportunity for this reoxygenation to happen.
Okay, let's drill down on a specific type of LDR permanent implants, like prostate seeds. Iodine-125, palladium-103, they stay in forever.
Right. This is different because the dose isn't delivered at a constant rate for a set time. The total dose comes from the isotope decaying over weeks and months.
So the dose rate starts high and then drops off exponentially.
Exactly. It follows the half-life of the isotope, which means, most of the biologically effective dose gets delivered relatively early on, maybe within the first few half-lives.
Like for I-125, that's about a 60-day half-life.
Yeah, around 60 days. So about half the total dose is delivered in those first 2 months, but the dose keeps trickling out for much longer, just at lower and lower rates.
And repair is happening this entire time, while the dose rate is falling.
Precisely. And this is absolutely critical. Because the dose delivery is spread over months, there's a massive amount of time for sublethal damage repair, both in normal tissues and the tumor.
And that explains the really high physical doses.
That's the key reason. Why can the rectum and bladder tolerate those incredibly high prescribed physical doses for prostate seeds like 145, 160 gray with I-125? It's because of that phenomenal amount of continuous repair happening during the long decay period. Without it, those doses would cause devastating toxicity.
Calculating the BED for that with decay and repair sounds like a nightmare.
It is complex, yeah. Requires integrating dose rate over time, accounting for repair kinetics simultaneously. There are specialized formulas, but for understanding the principle, especially for boards, the crucial takeaway isn't the math itself. It's understanding that permanent implants achieve huge normal tissue sparing because of the continuous repair that occurs over that very long dose delivery and decay time. The physical dose is sky high, but the biological effect on normal tissues is dramatically less due to repair.
Okay, clear. Let's switch gears completely. From the slow burn to the quick flash, high dose rate, HDR brachytherapy, feels more common now for many sites.
It does, yeah. And radiobiologically, it's actually much closer to what we're used to with external beam. HDR means a very high dose rate, usually over 12 grays per hour, but delivered in a really short burst. Minutes, typically.
And the source is temporary.
Right. Often it's a single tiny high-activity source, usually iridium-192, that travels through catheters placed in or near the tumor. And the treatment's typically broken up into multiple separate fractions, spaced out by hours or days.
So each HDR session is basically like one big fraction of external beam.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, each distinct HDR application acts radiobiologically like a single high-dose radiation fraction.
Which means repair doesn't happen during the burst, but between them.
Exactly. Unlike LDR, where repair is ongoing during delivery, with HDR, there's virtually no time for repair during those few minutes the source is out. The repair of sublethal damage happens in the gap between the fractions. That interval, usually 6 hours or more, is vital for letting normal tissues recover before the next dose.
So the other L's, repopulation, reassortment, reoxygenation, they also happen between the HDR fractions.
Yes, precisely. Just like with standard fractionated external beam, those processes play out during the time intervals between the HDR treatments.
Okay, and because it's delivered in these separate fractions, the standard linear quadratic model and the usual BED formula, they apply directly.
They do. The standard LQ model and that BED equation N times D times 1 plus alpha beta works perfectly for HDR. You just treat each application as a distinct fraction D within the overall treatment number N.
Okay, let's really nail down the comparison. LDR versus HDR, side by side biologically.
All right. Big difference number 1, dose rate. LDR low, 0.4 to 2 GRER. HDR high, usually 12 GR.
Exposure time per fraction.
LDR, continuous, days to months or even longer for permanent. HDR short, just minutes per application or fraction.
How repair works.
LDR relies on continuous repair during the long exposure. HDR relies on repair between the short, intense fractions.
Repopulation concern.
LDR. Big concern during the long treatment, especially for fast tumors. HDR concern is between fractions, like external beam.
Reassortment and reoxygenation.
LDR can happen gradually during the treatment. HDR happens between fractions.
The math, the biological model.
LDR needs those modified LQ models accounting for time and repair. HDR uses the standard LQ model per fraction. Simple.
And the main way normal tissues are spared.
LDR. Biologically, it's that continuous repair, HDR. It's repair between fractions, plus, really importantly, the physical advantage of precise placement and that steep dose gradient.
And where do we typically see them used?
Well, LDR historically for cervix, still common for prostate seeds, some other interstitial. HDR has largely taken over for temporary LDR sites like cervix, endometrium logistics, safety reasons, and it's very common now for prostate, breast, lung, palliative cases. Permanent LDR seeds are still a major player, though.
Right. Okay, let's talk isotopes, the actual radioactive sources. We've mentioned a few, but which ones are absolutely essential to know for LDR?
Okay, for LDR board's knowledge,
Yeah.
definitely iodine-125 and palladium-103. Those are the current permanent implant mainstays. And historically, cesium-137.
Tell us about iodine-125 again. Key facts.
Iodine-125, half-life, about 59.4 days, so we usually say 60 days. Average energy, low, around 28 keV.
Okay.
Range is like 3 to 35 keV
Yeah.
each. Number one use, permanent prostate seeds. That low energy is great for keeping the dose local, but it also means it gets absorbed quickly, so you have to be super careful with dosimetry.
Okay, and palladium-103.
Palladium-103, shorter half-life, 17 days. Even lower average energy, around 21 keV, also used for permanent prostate seeds.
Any reason to pick it over iodine?
Well, because the half-life is shorter, the dose gets delivered faster. So theoretically, it might be better for faster-growing tumors, although that's still debated clinically. The dose rate is initially higher.
Gotcha. And cesium-137,
Yeah.
the historical one.
Yeah, cesium-137, very long half-life, 30 years. Higher energy, 662 keV average. It was the standard for temporary LDR for a long time, like GYN intracavitary treatments.
Why phase it out?
Mainly security concerns around handling and storing long-lived, relatively high-energy sources. Plus, HDR with iridium-192 offered logistical advantages. So CS-137 is mostly historical context now.
Which leads us right to the HDR workhorse, iridium-192.
Exactly. Iridium-192, half-life, 73.8 days. Let's call it 74 days. Average energy, intermediate, around 380 keV with a wide spectrum.
And its advantages.
It's just a good balance. The energy gives decent penetration, but is still manageable. The specific activity is high enough for HDR rates. The half-life is long enough to treat multiple patients, but short enough that source replacement is routine, maybe every 3-4 months. It's versatile for intracavitary, interstitial, intraluminal, pretty much all HDR.
Okay. Now let's tackle something that sometimes trips people up. The inverse dose rate effect. We hear about it, but does it actually matter for clinical LDR?
Ah, yes. The idea that lowering the dose rate can sometimes increase cell killing because cells might get stuck in sensitive phases like G2M. It's definitely a real thing in vitro, in lab experiments with specific cell lines at very low dose rates.
Lower than clinical LDR rate.
Much lower, yeah.
Yeah.
The clinical LDR range 0.4 to 2 GIR is generally way too high for this effect to be dominant. The experiments showing a strong inverse effect are often down around like 0.01 to 0.1 GIR, an order of magnitude lower.
So in the clinic, at standard LDR rates, what's the main effect?
The overwhelming effect is increased survival due to repair, not increased killing. The repair happening during LDR is a much stronger influence than any potential G2M accumulation at those dose rates.
So bottom line, generally not clinically significant for LDR brachy.
Correct. Plus, in a real tumor in a patient, you have heterogeneity, different cell cycle times, quiescent cells. It all makes the inverse dose rate effect less likely to be a major player.
Any exception?
The one classic exception always mentioned is the testes. Spermatogonia are very sensitive to protracted LDR, likely due to their continuous cycling. So for testes, low dose rate can be more damaging. But for most tumor-normal tissue situations in LDR brachy, focus on repair as the key dose rate dependent factor.
Good clarification. Now, let's talk about maybe the biggest physical win for brachytherapy, something totally different from external beam, that steep dose gradient.
Absolutely huge. This is fundamental. Radiation intensity from a small source falls off incredibly fast with distance.
Why so fast?
It's mainly the inverse square law. Intensity is proportional to 1 over distance squared. Double the distance, the dose rate drops by a factor of 4. Triple it, it drops by 9. Plus, You have tissue absorbing some dose, attenuation, but close in, that inverse square fall-off is dramatic.
And what does that mean practically for the dose distribution?
It means you can get a scorching hot dose right next to the source where your tumor is, and just millimeters or a centimeter away, the dose plummets.
The clinical payoff being?
Fantastic normal tissue sparing.
Yeah.
You can deliver a really potent dose to the target volume, while organs right next door get a much, much lower dose because of that rapid fall-off.
Examples?
Classic examples. Cervix cancer. You pack the cervix and uterus, deliver a massive dose there, but the dose to the rectum and bladder wall, just centimeters away, drops dramatically. Or prostate seeds, super high dose within the prostate capsule, but a sharp fall off protecting the nearby rectum and bladder.
And that's hard to match with external beam.
Very hard. Even with fancy techniques like IMRT or SBRT, which are great at conforming dose, achieving such a sharp gradient right at the edge of the target is tough. External beam often involves beams passing through more tissue, potentially giving a broader low-dose bath. Brachytherapy's physics inherently minimizes that spread right near the source.
Okay, so putting all this together, the biology, the physics, LDR versus HDR, how do clinicians decide between LDR and HDR when both might be options?
It's a multifactorial decision, really. You look at the tumor itself, size, location, how fast you think it's growing, then practical things. How easy is it to access the site for temporary HDR catheters? Can the patient tolerate staying in the hospital for a temporary LDR implant or handle the precautions for a permanent one?
Patient convenience is a big one.
Huge. HDR is usually outpatient fractions. Traditional temporary LDR might mean days in the hospital, though permanent seeds are outpatient LDR. Radiation safety for staff, family, the public, that's another major consideration, especially with permanent implants.
And the radiobiology we discussed feeds directly into this choice.
Absolutely. If maximizing normal tissue sparing via continuous repair is paramount, maybe because late effects are a huge concern, and you're not too worried about rapid tumor growth during treatment, LDR might have a biological edge.
And HDR.
If you are worried about repopulation during a long LDR course, or if you want the flexibility of optimizing the dose with each fraction, or maybe need that higher dose per fraction punch, then HDR might be better, relying on repair between fractions and the physical dose shaping.
And underlying all of it.
You're always leveraging that amazing steep dose gradient, whether it's LDR or HDR. That's a constant benefit.
Plus, knowing the isotope properties is key.
Definitely. Half-life determines dose rate change and source duration. Energy affects penetration and shielding. You got to match the isotope to the job.
This has been really comprehensive. Let's try to boil it down. What are the absolute high-yield takeaways, the clinical pearls for residents studying this?
Okay, let's list them. Pearl number 1. LDR radiobiology is dominated by continuous repair of sublethal damage during the long exposure. That's its main biological feature.
Pearl 2. HDR radiobiology is basically like fractionated external beam. Repair happens between the short, intense fractions.
Pearl 3. Key LDR isotopes to know. Iodine-125, 60-day half-life, 28 keV energy for permanent seeds. Palladium-103, 17-day half-life, 21 keV energy, also permanent seeds. Cesium-137, 30-year half-life, 662 keV, the historical temporary LDR source.
Okay.
Pearl 4. The HDR workhorse is iridium-192. Remember, 74-day half-life, 380 keV average energy, used for almost all temporary HDR.
Pearl 5, the inverse dose rate effect. Generally not a big clinical factor at typical LDR rates. The main effect is more survival due to repair, except maybe for the test eyes.
And Pearl 6, maybe the most important practical point. Brachytherapy's superpower is the steep dose gradient. Inverse square law plus attenuation gives amazing normal tissue sparing right next to the target.
Those are 6 excellent pearls. Really sums it up. Ready for a quick board blitz style review? Put these to the test.
Yeah, let's do it. Fire away.
Okay. Question 1. In low-dose rate brachytherapy, the primary radiobiological advantage for sparing normal tissues compared to a single acute high-dose rate exposure is A. Increased reoxygenation of normal tissues. B. Greater cell cycle reassortment in normal tissues. C. Significant repopulation of normal tissue stem cells during irradiation. Or D. Continuous repair of sublethal damage in normal tissues during the protracted exposure. That's got to be D. Continuous repair. That's the main mechanism allowing normal tissues to tolerate LDR better than an equivalent acute dose. Correct. Question 2. Which of the following radionuclides is most commonly used for permanent interstitial prostate seed implants? A. Iridium-192. B. Cesium-137, C. Cobalt-60, D. Iodine-125.
That's D again, iodine-125, by far the most common for prostate seeds.
Yep. Question 3. The steep dose gradient achieved with brachytherapy sources is primarily a consequence of A. The high LET of the emitted radiation, B. The inverse square law in tissue attenuation, C. The short half-life of most brachytherapy isotopes, or D. The occurrence of the inverse dose rate effect.
That's B. It's physics. Inverse square law is the dominant factor close-in, plus some attenuation.
Perfect. Last one, question 4. What is the approximate average photon energy and half-life of iridium-192, commonly used in HDR brachytherapy? A. Energy, 28 keV half-life, 60 days. B. Energy, 21 keV half-life, 17 days. C. Energy, 662 keV half-life, 30 years. D. Energy, 380 keV half-life, 74 days.
Okay, iridium-192, that's D. Average energy around 380 keV, half-life around 74 days.
Excellent. Nailed it. Okay, so wrapping up this session on brachytherapy radiobiology.
We really saw how putting sources close to the tumor changes the biological game.
Yeah, LDR using that continuous repair for tissue sparing, but fighting repopulation.
While HDR acts like fractionated external beam with repair breaks in between fractions.
We cover the key isotopes I-125, PD-103 for LDR seeds, I-192 is the HDR standard, and their properties you need to know.
And cleared up that the inverse dose rate effect isn't the main story clinically for LDR repair is.
And kept coming back to that crucial advantage, the steep dose gradient driven by physics, saving normal tissues.
It really highlights why brachytherapy is still such a vital tool. It does things biologically and physically that external beam just can't quite match in the same way.
Absolutely. Thinking ahead,
Yeah.
we mostly talked about brachytherapy on its own. But what happens to the radiobiology when we start combining it more with, say, immunotherapy or targeted agents? How does that steep dose gradient interact with a systemic therapy? Does the immune response change in that high-dose region versus the rapid fall-off zone?
That's a really interesting question. How local high-dose effects synergize or interfere with systemic treatments?
Definitely a frontier area.
Something to keep thinking about. Okay, for more practice, including oral boards prep, definitely check out radoncSmartLearn.com and be sure to subscribe to Rad Onc Smart Review for our next session. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.